But I think ultimately we need to make sure that that transparency is there for the consumer to say, hey, this is the information I want to give. I'm making a decision as an individual. This is the value exchange I'm getting.
Pam Haran, the advisor. Pam's wealth of experience at IDG, Woman.com, and mainly as president of the Online Publishers Association gives her wonderful insights and perspective into the challenges facing marketers and publishers. We chatted mainly about the theme of the day, which was monopolistic powers and the antitrust issues that arise out of that.
So, figuratively speaking, most people would say Google, Facebook, obviously these are monopolies. But are these literally monopolies in the context of antitrust, in the benchmarks of AT&T, Standard Oil, and Microsoft?
No, I think that's an excellent question. I think there's a lot of discussion that is a combination of emotional as well as rational. And I think a lot of the discussion today is centered around the emotional, which is these are too big, they are controlling too much of the economy. But I think that if one looks at what the definition of antitrust laws are, that's really where the litmus test needs to be made. We have a lot of social problems today, and antitrust laws aren't designed to address social problems. I think that, if we look at the wealth inequality, tax laws are designed to hopefully address that. Or if we look at, challenges with personal data, they need to be managed differently. It's not about antitrust. So I think that we need to get beyond this emotional dialogue and I think frustration to really get down to what is the definition of economic benefit or negative aspect of what's going on today.
So, if you break down AT&T, Standard Oil, it was a lot, from my vantage point, it was a lot about vertical and horizontal integration. But I think you could argue a lot of that, like Google buying DoubleClick, YouTube, and et cetera, et cetera. Where I think there's a little bit of a pushback is where's the harm to consumers?
Well, that's exactly. So that's my point about if we look at the definition of what antitrust is about. It's the economic negative impact for a consumer, and that really is where I think that we need to further look at that. The consumer's making a decision where they want to spend their time. And ultimately, I think that the transparency that's so critical in terms of the negative impact, ultimately, we need to make sure that the consumer's aware of what's taking place. But I don't think that really goes back to antitrust.
So, for the longest time, to benefit from the four safe harbors of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, these platforms were like, look, we're neutral, UGC, user-generated content, leave us alone. And it made sense for them. It was a great model. But then eventually, especially with the EU, hate speech and, brand safety and right-winger, point of views, all of a sudden, YouTube, Google, and Facebook don't have a choice. They're kind of thrown in. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel, if you're going to ban the right-winger, do you ban the left-winger? Do you, how do you decide? You're in the boardroom, you're advising these companies. Where do you draw the line?
Well, early on, we had this, when I was running the Online Publishers Association, and UGC content was really emerging. It was at its infancy. One of the things that the publishers became responsible for was what was the conversation that was taking place on their websites, because the reality was they were providing a platform. So I think very similarly, Facebook and all these platforms need to have some accountability around the environment that they're creating and the platform that they're providing. It is a slippery slope, certainly in terms of, can you mandate what one side can say, and if you have a political view that you may align with the others, do you allow them to have a platform? But I think that there are some areas that really the organizations should define in terms of that is not acceptable. We're learning as we go, and certainly there is a lot of value that something like a Facebook or certainly Google provides. But at the end of the day, there is some social responsibility that we all have. And unfortunately, there's always going to be bad people in this world, but we need to provide some rails in which they have to operate within.
Indeed, the bad hombres. So who is the most vulnerable? Who's the biggest bad hombre in terms of the Google, Amazon, Facebook? Because we lump them together. I know who I think is the most evil or the most likely to abuse. From your vantage point, who is the biggest misbehaving party, or who is the one most likely to be targeted by government?
Well, I mean, most recently, obviously, with what Facebook did with the whole data.
Name it. Which one?
But I think that, and I believe that we are in a time where there is a lot of finger pointing, there's a lot of lack of accountability. And I think that that's one of the things that we have, as an industry, we've tried to live by this self-regulation. But unfortunately, the bad hombres, are always going to be out there. But I think if we don't find a way to regulate ourselves, government, which tends to not be very well educated when it comes to the issues of running different types of industries, they are going to potentially do things that are going to ultimately, I think, be more negative than us finding a way to navigate these waters ourselves. When I was running the Online Publishers Association, part of what we talked about was the value of that first-party relationship that a consumer has with their audience. And I think that's one of the things that we need to really take a step back and say, what are the implicit or explicit perceptions that a consumer has? And how do we continue to make sure that they're getting the value that they see, but the transparency that they understand, whether it's about how their data is being used, and in the case, getting back to Facebook, talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think that they really stepped over the lines when they were not being responsible with the way that the data was being used.
Okay, so shareholders don't really have a say here because Google and Facebook, the way the stock structures are set up, the founders control everything. And marketers have not really seemed to care. You'll see Procter & Gamble show leadership, but then they're like, okay, we got to reach this audience. And in the case of YouTube, and in the case of Facebook, it's so efficient. And you can't blame them. It's not reverend marketer. They're for business. So is it by default government's role? Because government doesn't really understand this. When they go up in front of Congress, you see they don't get it. Consumers don't care. Like, I love that Google Docs is free. So there's no harm there. There's harm in other ways. Is this basically us in the industry, the echo chamber, making a big deal about something? Or is there something really there?
Well, and I think it depends on the individual, and also I think it's generational. So, we look at a lot of 20-year-olds I know are willing to give up all their information to get a gift card from Target versus, a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old, especially in our industry, that knows how their data is going to be used. I mean, I don't have I own an Echo, I own, and I haven't set it up because I don't want it always listening to me. Not that I'm saying anything that interesting, but again, I think part of it is generational. I think that ultimately we need to police ourselves. The government is that's at the end of the day that I don't think is going to benefit anybody in this. But I think ultimately we need to make sure that transparency is there for the consumer to say, hey, this is the information I want to give. I'm making a decision as an individual. This is the value exchange I'm getting, and for us to respect that. For those that don't want to give that information, then that's up to them as well.
So switching gears, journalism with a capital J is expensive. And my understanding as like a wannabe history of media is the monopolies in local news and advertising and classifieds were making so much money that it was easy for them to kind of be like, we're going to fund journalism and whatnot, which is great. Today, if you fast forward, Craigslist, YouTube, Google, and all that, they've disrupted that. They are now the monopolies. They could care less about journalism. Is journalism as, like, let's say in the 20th century, is that dead? Or is it ever going to come back? Like, it's expensive. Nobody really wants to fund it. And when you get billionaires funding it, it usually doesn't go well. So should we just kind of realize that, hey, things change? We used to ride horses. We now have cars. Let's move on. Are these attempts to bring back journalism ill-fated, no matter what?
I don't think they're ill-fated. I think they're absolutely critical. I think we do need organizations that are going to question whether it's our politicians, which is our lawmakers. That is something that is critical to our democracy. So whether, we heard this morning that the New York Times has more editors than they've ever had. I think 2,600 or 2,800 editors. At a time when people are saying, journalism is dead. I think that the reality is that it's going to continue to evolve. We've seen many newspaper companies go out of business. But the reality is that there's going to always be a role for journalists. The way that they are defined or what they look like is going to potentially change. I think we're looking at some of these new outlets that are trying to find new ways to connect with consumers. So as I said, it's also very generational. There may or may not be a young, generation that's willing to read the New York Times or Washington Post, two publications which I read every day and love. So the reality is these companies need to evolve to stay relevant to their audiences. And this is what I fought for 10 years. It's a hard fight. But the reality is we need to say, okay, what does a consumer want? A millennial wants more of an experience. They want to be able to connect with the community. So it's what are you doing in terms of creating opportunities for them to do that? There's no silver bullet here, but I do believe the role of journalism, even though it's going to change, is going to continue to always be critical to the democracy.
Very quick, I want to get two questions.
Yeah.
One is how much of that is going to be professional journalism? How much of that is going to be more the blogger, citizen journalist model?
Well, I mean, I think that there's an opportunity for both of those to exist, because I think it gets back to what is important to you in terms of the way you make your decisions. I think one of the challenges is if we're always in this echo chamber of only reading the stuff of the people that we think are, going to have the same point of view as we do. That's the challenge. One of the things why I read the New York Times every day, it's the adjacent article that I would have never sought out. I mean, and that's one of the challenges that digital still has. You don't have that adjacency to see content that you otherwise wouldn't see.
And final question, so media when it comes to inclusion and diversity is a lot more, well representative of gender,
Yeah.
But it's not perfect. What's the takeaway that we could apply to other industries to make the ratio a bit more representative?
Hit me again in terms of
Is it just because that marketing draws more women to begin with? Or marketing and media is creative, so it's generally historically, if you've been oppressed, you spill out that through creativity. So it's could you apply to engineering? Could you apply to law?
Sure. No, and I think that's happening. I mean, certainly if we look at what's gone on with the Me Too generation, there's a new voice that has come out, and I think that there's an opportunity for more voices to be heard. I think that there are more and more outlets that are looking to serve those diverse audiences, and I think that we need to continue to give them a platform to do so. I mean, I know that sounds like, a wonderful statement, but the reality is that they are finding more and more ways to do that through new media outlets that are forming to serve those different audiences.